All right. Good morning, peasants and plebes. Good to be with you. Just had a really bad feedback, so hopefully the audio is going to work here this morning. If you guys end up having some issues, if I end up having some issues, you guys let me know. So, a few things have changed since last week. What was it? I don't know. One evening last week, I was kind of in a righteous mood, so I put together just a very thin notes and decided to go live with it. And as it turns out, that one live has within the last week gathered more views than anything else I've done on this channel combined. So, to those of you that are new and joining, welcome to my little tiny corner of the internet. What you saw last week with me being righteous is not typical of the kind of things that I do on this channel. Usually with this channel, I like to focus on more topics that are interest of me and relevant, not so much complaining about things that are happening in the church. So today we are going to finish a discussion that I've been having for a few lives now. I would really recommend, if you haven't, go back and watch some of the other previous lives I have on eugenics, contraceptives, and the feminist movement. And here we're going to finish up what I've started with those talks, specifically with Margaret Sanger, who I began discussing the other week. To back up just a little bit, we left off with Sanger working with a Harlemite and fellow eugenicist W.E.B. Du Bois to get clinics opened in the Harlem area of New York, thus ushering in her dream of bringing contraceptives to the poor and the downtrodden. Here today, we are at an interesting point in history, and I want you guys to kind of reflect for a moment. In the year 2020, with the George Floyd protests in the United States and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and others as such, we saw this trend of the removal of statues and names, primarily and mostly of, quote, safe men that are in the United States anyways, that are safe to hate. The Robert E. Lees, the Stonewall Jackson, the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons. These are men that by and large are safe. The white liberal establishment on the left has deemed these men safe for us to hate. Now, of course, when Trump lost the election, all of that social justice warrioring that was quelled and the funds dried up because, we can't have Mother Revolution interrupting when our good old boys in the Democratic Party are in power. But rest assured, there will be a day that will come again, maybe soon, when the flames of the mob are stoked yet again. More importantly, when they are subsidized yet again. But the thing about revolutions is that they're a tricky sort to control. Right? We were right on the precipice with the Black Lives Matter running out of old Confederate soldiers to hate. And there was the beginning of these discussions, whispers in the hallway, of the left's fabled heroes themselves. Now, it's funny because when you turn to academia, the trust the science folks, do some looking into this and you will find that they will pretzel themselves into every which shape to excuse and nuance people like Margaret Sanger. Some of the peer-reviewed articles I've referenced for these lectures, you can see they want so bad for Sanger to not be a racist. The National Library of Medicine has an article by a Valenza defending Sanger. NPR has a fact-checked article. I have articles from the New York Times, from Reuters, all attempting to apologize for Sanger, for Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood itself has the opposition claims about Margaret Sanger that I referenced last week. Ellen Chesler, of the Roosevelt Institute think tank and author of a biography of Sanger and the birth control movement, said the decision to repudiate Sanger lacks historical nuance. Now, I had to chuckle when I read that because you will find ne'er one of these same institutions, ne'er one of these same people excusing a Robert E. Lee or a George Washington there where we should be aware of the nuances. You know, they will add no degree of nuance to the lives of these people whose statues they all embraced toppling a few years ago. And I could do a whole course on the trust the science folks, how faulty and weak their methods are, but it would be a major digression for this. But I think you get the point. The point is here specifically is that it was kind of a shame that the election happened when it did because revolution being the mother that devours her own children. I think it was Edmund Burke that said that. Anyways, if he didn't, he should have. We were so close to seeing this happen. And if the mob is incited again, I really do believe that you will see them going after leftist historical figures. Again, we were so close to it last time. They had already toppled down all the old white men, and the beast was going to come for its own next. And Sanger, Margaret Sanger, has a big old fat target right on her forehead. And my goal today is to explore some of the ways in which she, as we've yet to determine here, either used the eugenics movement to serve her own ends, or if she was a legitimate adherent of, at minimum, parts of the tenets of what the eugenics movement taught and sought to bring about. And I don't think it's as clear as the apologists for Sanger want to make it. So we're going to take a little bit of time to look and make our case. And while I'm trying to be fair, I've stated that in all of these talks. I'm trying to be fair. I'm not trying to straw man these people. I'm also not going to spend my time here making the apologist's case. You can go and check out some of the others. I mean, you do quick searches on Margaret Sanger and issues of race, and you will find the apologist all over a quick Google search. The gist of their argument is that we can excuse parts of her past as them being a mostly inconsequential product of the times that she lived in, having little bearing on her philosophy or purported goals, and the organizations and the movement itself having little bearing on those for that matter. Coming from the other side, though, there is some quite damning evidence because, for example, in the course of her advocating for the birth control movement, again, we have to go back and watch the last lecture. She's going around the country. She's giving lectures. One of the places that she's giving lectures to is women's auxiliaries of the KKK, advocating for eugenics and the birth control as a means of suppressing the minority groups that these women auxiliaries are seeking to suppress. And as noted, she fully embraced the Buck versus Bell Supreme Court decision to allow forced sterilization of minority women. She supported the first human trials of birth control conducted on women in Puerto Rico with with her knowing full well that the women who were involved were not given informed consent and were not told that the drugs were still in an experimental phase of testing. In 1939, she formed what she called the Negro Project, where her goal was to convert as many black leaders to the birth control movement as possible. In particular, she targeted black doctors and preachers, including Martin Luther King Jr. himself, who later said of Sanger that, quote, there is a striking kinship between our movement and Sanger's early efforts. Our sure beginning in the struggle for equality by non-violent direct action may not have been so resolute without the tradition established by Margaret Sanger and people like her. End quote. In a notorious letter to Clarence Gamble of Procter and Gamble fame in 1939, Sanger said, quote, we do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Now, this particular quote that they have so desperately tried to whitewash by saying that Sanger is being misconstrued here, that what she meant is that they don't want the African Americans to come to a false perception of the birth control movement's intentions. And that may have some validity were it not for the fact that Mrs. Sanger herself here is writing to her friend, heir to the Procter and Gamble fortune, who himself was a notorious racist and eugenicist. Gamble pushed through laws in North Carolina that were directly targeting at forced sterilization of African American women. In fact, in 2011, the state of North Carolina was forced to pay restitution to the families of the victims of these women. And Sanger also advocated for placing, quote, so-called illiterates, paupers, unemployables, criminals, prostitutes, and dope fiends on farms and in open spaces as long as necessary for the strengthening and development of moral conduct, end quote. In other words, folks, she wanted to open gulags here in the United States for those the progressives deemed unfit for society. And I'm sorry, apologists out there, but you have to own these things. Despite being fully aware of all of this, listen to what President and CEO of Planned Parenthood, Alexis McGill Johnson, said in a New York Times article on Sanger. Quote, the first step is making Margaret Sanger less prominent in our present and future. The first step to moving forward. The Planned Parenthood Federation of America has already renamed awards previously given in her honor, and Planned Parenthood of Greater New York renamed its Manhattan Health Center in 2020. Other independently managed affiliates may choose to follow. Sanger remains an influential part of our history and will not be erased. But as we tell the history of Planned Parenthood's founding, we must fully take responsibility for the harm that Sanger caused to generations of people with disabilities and Black and Latino, Asian American, and Indigenous people. End quote. So, while doing untold harms to minority women and claiming we're not going to whitewash the history or attempt to erase it, when in fact, that's exactly what they're in the process of doing. While saying that they're not going to whitewash history or erase it, they are, in fact, attempting to erase and whitewash their own history. And you can't make this stuff up, folks. It's almost I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it myself. They're removing her name from the buildings, from street signs, from awards they've given out, and they're especially doing this within the African American communities. What do you think the real purpose of her removal is, other than to make people forget? Like, move along, folks, nothing to see here. As George Orwell famously warned us in 1984, the people will exist in a perpetual state of now, where the past is constantly scrubbed clean. And this leads me to the last thing I want to focus on here, a sort of final food for thought for you guys to ponder. Was the racial legacy of Margaret Sanger and her organization an inconsequential product of its day, or does it affect the policies and practices of Planned Parenthood to this day? And if the latter, how can we as Catholics reach out to our friends in the African American community, those who always have rightly known that something's up with this, that something's not right? Again, go back and watch the previous video. Especially the more astute in the community have raised alarm bells for a long time that this group is entering their communities to do harm, and we should help these people as allies in the goal of ending all of this. For the legacy, we have a pretty consistent trail of tears right up to our own day of what this organization has done to these communities. And while Margaret Sanger herself dies in 1966, her organization grew exponentially in 1972, especially with the passing of Roe v. Wade. Planned Parenthood started performing abortions at their clinics. In 1975, you have African American Dr. Laverne Tolbert being invited to sit in on board meetings, and this is what she had to say of the experience. Quote, over time, I noticed that several of the board members arrived in chauffeured limousines. Who were these men of wealth, I wondered, and why were they so interested in the people who lived in the inner city? Once in the building, I, as in she, walked past the clinic that served primarily African American and Latino girls. The elevator took her upstairs to an imposingly large boardroom where she took her seat with the striking observation that she was the only person of color in the room. The majority of the board members were male, and the handful of women appeared to be much older than her and her 27 years. She says during the course of her 5 year tenure, she received a lot of literature. Most discussed population control and the concern for the growing number of people in the world, poor people in the United States and developing countries. As the population grew, this should be ringing bells for those of you that watched the previous ones. As the population grew, natural resources like air, water, and food were going to shrink, and she says that she soon understood why the full name for this organization was Planned Parenthood World Population. She says, I struggled with the question, which population are they trying to control? End quote. She goes on to say elsewhere that as a black woman, the question kept coming back to her like a boomerang. She wondered why abortion was more necessary for her ethnic group, why this organization fought so hard to have this particular right when the rights for better education, better jobs, and better housing seemed paramount. She says, and I thought about what housing and jobs, she says, and I thought, what about housing and jobs in schools? And every time I asked the question, the boomerang came back to me. And I realized that Planned Parenthood World Population, as it was called at the time, had but one goal, and that was to control the population of those people they considered dysgenic, that is, unhealthy, those people who should not be procreating. In a televised debate with U.S. Representative Bob Dornan in 1989, then Planned Parenthood President Faye Waddleton admitted that Planned Parenthood accepted donations from, quote, people who want to support us because they want all welfare mothers and all black women to stop having children, end quote. Merle McGee, the New York chapter's chief equity and engagement officer, who wrote, quote, the biggest concern with Margaret Sanger is her public support for the eugenics medical philosophy, which was rooted in racism, ableism, and classism, end quote. And that's rooted, mind you. And think about the concept of using a word like root for an analogy. Roots aren't something that you can say are inconsequential to the functioning of the system today. I mean, is this not what the left constantly preaches about American racism writ large? that at its very roots, this country is racist, ableist, and classist, and that it can't just be undone because it's systemic, it's at the roots. So if this is true for the state, why is it not true for the organization? Somehow the organization gets an exemption passed. But wait, there's more. In June 2020, Planned Parenthood Board of Directors was publicly praising President of the Greater New York offices, Laura McQuaid. And this, we're right up here at the steps of the modern world here, right? This is 2020. Only 1 week after these praises, they were ousting her amid a flurry of reports from staff all over the organization that McQuaid, a wealthy white woman, was being accused of, quote, berating and humiliating the African American employees, presiding over a system that paid them unequally and kept them from advancing in their careers, and supporting layoffs, furloughs for nearly a third of the organization's employees amid the COVID-19 crisis without cutting her own pay of 500,000 or that of the other top officials, end quote. Letters signed by at least 350 employees included a litany of concerns like witnessing McQuaid yell, berate, slam her fists, verbally abuse, humiliate, and bully African American employees, often brutally shaming staff members in internal meetings in front of their colleagues, as one letter states. From the same letter, quote, people could hear her down the hallway screaming and berating people. So, one of the letters states that the racism at the organization goes well beyond Mrs. Quaid, though it stated that things had only worsened under her tenure, and that, quote, white and non black employees are still given more pay and more advancement opportunities than the black colleagues. Yet, we are supposed to sit here and believe that all of this is merely coincidental, that the historical roots of racism from Sanger and within the organization's founding and its philosophy, it's mere coincidence. All the claims rooted in the founding of the organizations of trying to do things like eliminating African Americans and minorities were mere inconsequential products of a bygone era. You know, at this point, I have spent 4 videos discussing this topic, and I hope you guys can kind of walk away from this having learned some things you can take with you, you know, into the world, into the discussion of these things with others. African Americans in particular need to really be made aware of this history. Those who are our allies in the pro-life cause, especially, have often been accused when they speak up about these things. They're often accused of being Uncle Toms, when in fact, as the history shows, the real Uncle Toms are are more likely the minorities who have been duped and sold a bill of goods, while in fact they are doing the bidding of certain racist progressive whites whose goal it is to eliminate their people. And to my fellow white friends out there, do not, and I mean this, I have seen this my whole life from my white colleagues. Do not let the left establish the narrative in your minds for how African Americans or Latinos or any other group of people think. The left does not, despite years of trying to harness and social engineer the change, they do not have hegemony over people's minds based solely on color or ethnicity. And trust me on this, guys. I mean, trust me. There are so many African Americans out there, and Latinos, and Africans, and Asians, etc., who despise the left as much, if not more, than you do. And for very good reason. I've recommended it before. I will recommend it again. Go read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Personally, over and above Martin Luther King, who the left has deemed safe and has canonized, I think, because they fear people turning to someone like Malcolm X, who held the white liberal left's hypocrisy right up to their faces. Not to mention the fact that very large contingents of Hispanics are extremely right wing. Now, look, I'm not wholesale like blanket endorsing right wing politics here, but what I am saying is I have seen way too many of my fellow white colleagues my whole life who have let the left define the narrative on these things. When the left come out with an organization like Black Lives Matters or whatever, well, let me for example, have you noticed that the alphabet group with their little colored flag, do you notice that stuck in the flag now, they've snuck it in there, a little line that is black and brown? It's probably not something you noticed, or if you did, it's something that you probably think that African Americans at large would agree with. And it's an absolute abomination to the legacy of the historical injustices that African Americans have faced to lump them in with the T group or the LGB group for that matter, who would dare hijack that struggle as their own when they're two totally separate things. I know for a fact there are way more African Americans who are disgusted with that than those who side with it. So, what I'm saying here is don't fall for the rhetoric that some on the right who want to just hand over all of these people to leftist causes. Many of these people are allies. The global South, for example, I talk quite a bit on this channel about, is overwhelmingly socially conservative. And we need to be better about allying ourselves outside of our own little pockets of communities, especially here in the United States. We need to, as Catholics especially, have a much broader universal approach to these things. And I do look, I don't disagree with subsidiarity. I agree with keeping many of our struggles local, but at the same time, don't let them isolate you. Don't let them think that you're this like little pocket of people, that the whole world's against you. There's way more people on your side than what you would realize. So, where have we gone here? I started these with the Scopes monkey trial. And I did that because, let's see, the Scopes monkey trial is set up in the history books here in the United States as this exemplar of science and the moral high ground that science takes over bumpkin religious people. And then not only that, the years of propaganda of raising young people on this myth has, I think, perpetuated these ideas. I do think that there's probably a little bit of a rebellion against it, maybe in modernism within the last 10 years or so. But historically, I mean, we're almost 100 years since the what was it, 1927 was the Scopes monkey trial. So we're coming up on 100 years of that. Well, for the last 100 years, the left science folk have controlled that narrative that this was a great battle of science versus religion, where, as we discussed in that lecture, what it actually was a group of eugenicists who want to wipe out and eliminate vast quantities of people, because we followed up that Scopes monkey trial with a lecture on the social Darwin movement and the advent of the eugenics movement out of that, and how that was tied to these fears about world population exploding and we were going to run out of supplies. And let's see, then there was, related to that within the eugenics movement itself, was this idea of breeding a superior races of people, like you would breed Rottweilers or Doberman Pinschers or pit bulls or something. We followed that up with the rise of the feminist movement, which is closely tied and intertwined with the early feminist movement and early eugenics movement are intertwined with one another. So we've got all of these pieces to this puzzle here, and we ended it with Margaret Sanger, who was probably one of the more consequential people to come out of these movements, and her goals of racial cleansing, despite the fact that people are trying to whitewash her and erase her from the history. I don't think that we as Catholics should allow that to happen. We have to keep her name at the forefront and the philosophy, because if they manage to whitewash it, they'll be able to continue the work that they're doing in these communities unchecked. Whereas, as we have known for some time with the African American, especially the African American communities, hesitancy to allow these abortion clinics and these birth control movement clinics into their communities, if we keep the eye on the prize, which is that these things actually came about with certain goals to eliminate your own people, we have the not only do we have the righteous side here, I think we have the winning side. And this is truly a subject that Catholics need to stop being apologetic for. We are the ones really, and this is what all of this ultimately, if I had to sum up these last 4 lectures on this, we are the ones that are on the right side of history. Catholics in particular here, because contraceptives, the birth control movement, is from Satan. The entire movement itself is riddled with anti-life, anti anti-human flourishing. It is the culture of death that we had been warned about. And it was the Catholic Church alone who was who was stood up against this. I don't care if certain Protestants or Orthodox want to say, well, the early church, blah, 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 and it was unclear and it was fuzzy. So therefore no, like we have what the purported goals of these people were from the 20th century moving forward, and what the birth control movement and the contraceptive movement is about. And we as Catholics are the ones that are on the right side of this history. And I want you guys, I see so many Catholics who are almost like embarrassed about our stance on the contraceptives and birth controls. I don't know about you guys, but I'm tired of seeing Catholics always on the defensive. We need folks on the offensive. We need to be out there vocally taking down these perpetrators of the culture of death. While we sit here passive, Planned Parenthood realizes the scandal that they're sitting on, and they're desperately trying to erase its history before anyone really notices so they can continue on with the extermination program. Whitewashing Sanger from their history is not reckoning with their past as they say they're doing. The only way that they can reckon with their past, whose precepts are rooted in the organization itself, is to see the day that its doors are permanently closed. And that's what our goal is. And we should be vocal about it. We should have the intention of doing that. Let's see. That's what I've got for you guys today. Just reading some comments here. I wrote a college paper on Margaret Sanger back in the 80s. I was shocked. Truly an evil woman, honored by many progressive liberals who advocate daily for the slaughter of unborn, mostly minority. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, this is 100% what we are, our duty and our goal, and what we have to be responsible for is getting this message out there loud and clear. Scopes was 25. Yeah, so we're right on. Was it 25? I thought it was 20. Okay. Yeah, no, that's right. You're 25. So yeah, so we're right here at 100 years since Scopes. So guys, that's all I've got for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a long series, and again, if this is the first one that you're watching, I would recommend going back and watching the others. I do think that there is an entire theological field of discussing the birth control movement. We all know Pope St. Paul VI and Humanae Vitae, and there is some really beautiful theological insights and things like that. But we also have history on our side, and that's kind of what I want to make clear with all of this. The history of where the contraceptives and the birth control movement come from a truly dark place. Now, I will say, and I've said it in some of the past videos, that there were a few people, and even at times Sanger herself, who at least convinced herself that she was doing the right thing and that she was helping the poor and the downtrodden. But if you take, this is why I think it's so important for us who are of a little bit more traditional bent, conservative bent, though I don't even like using that word, to take the progressives' logic to its end, even if they absolutely refuse. You kind of have to take these things to the furthest extreme ends of where these ideas lead to, because this is one of my biggest criticisms of the progressive movement. It never just ends. There is no, like, if you think about progressive, right? Like, what are they trying to progress towards? And many of the well-meaning ones have a stopping point, right? Like Margaret Sanger herself was against abortion. The stopping point for her was birth control. That was her identity, that was her movement. She wanted to stop short of abortion. But look what happened with the next generation, right? And with the next generation, all the way up into the 90s, when I first became aware of these things, it was all the narrative was safe. Oh gosh, what was it? Safe and affordable or something like that. Like only on rare extreme circumstances. 30 years later now we have, shout your abortion from the rooftops, right? So we have to be willing to stand here and hold this mirror up to the progressives. The trust the science folks. Okay, well we have illustrations now of 100+ years of the progressive movement, and I think scientifically we can say that the progressive movement, with each succeeding generation, progresses beyond what the progressive movement's purported goals are right now. So we have to be willing to sit here and say, okay, these are the logical places that your ideas are going to take us. And even if I will grant, I don't grant birth control, but let's say I grant birth control. What are your goals to stop the next generation from coming in and taking your ideology where it logically would follow and logically would lead to? What is your plan to stop that from happening? Father Father John has here. It's like with the communists. What happens if we meet our list of Communist Party demands? Then we give you another list of demands. I remember, oh gosh, there were so many like little. I mean, Vladimir Lenin was a nightmare, an awful person. He's got these great little quotes though that just summarize like how he viewed the world. One of them was kind of related to this, that he was willing to learn. Excuse me. Vladimir Lenin said he was willing to eliminate 2/3 of the world's population if the remaining third was communist. And the other thing he said was that they were going to hang the last capitalist with the rope that they manufactured. And we're not exactly like far from that either, though it's a totally different. I would have to get into the globalist Western Eastern debate between what happened there, but it's not totally far from something like this actually happening. But anyways, guys, coming up just short of 40 minutes here. I'm glad you guys tuned in. And that's all I'm going to say about this one. I might come back around to some of the theological points of the Catholics' position on birth control. But for now, I just wanted to get you guys a little bit comfortable with the history of it, a little bit comfortable with the not just the defense, but how we are actually have enough of the history on our side that we should actually be on the offense out there in the world. And one, not letting these people scrub their own history, and two, actually making them reckoning with their history, and three, the what I think should be our goal, the eventual shutdown of these organizations, because I don't think you can wrest from the roots of these organizations what their initial goals and ends were. Now, I do admit that there needs to be some cultural shifts and changes in the mindsets of many people, because we have a whole lot of people that are bought hook, line, and sinker into the birth control and the contraceptives lifestyle. But at the same time, I think if you really listen to what's going on, especially if you listen to like certain women talking about these things, a lot of women do not like birth control, and they don't like the effect that it has on them, on their body. And I think deep down they don't like the effect that it's having on their relationships. So that's some areas that I think the Catholics need to be more pushing towards, is the scientific research of coming back of what birth control does to women, what it does to the relationships that women are in. And we've got so much of this is in the favor of the way that the Catholic Church. I mean, it's if you don't believe that the Catholic Church is divinely guided, then we sure do get. I know Father John, if you're still here, you liked your baseball analogies. what's our batting average is pretty darn good if this was all a coincidence, right? Because as it turns out, I think we truly did come out on the right side against all others, against all odds. We came out on the right side on the contraceptive movement. You know anything about what happened with Paul VI? He even with the majority of his with the bishops that he sent out an appeal for, it was all looking like things were going to turn towards the church making a shift on the contraceptive movement, and we stood our ground. Thanks be to God. So, anyways, guys, I'm gonna head out. I appreciate you all. I will see you all soon. Take care.